It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind where the sun filters through your curtains just right, and you feel like everything might actually go your way today. But then, as I stepped out to grab the newspaper, I noticed something lying on my doormat. An envelope. At first glance, it looked innocent enough. White, crisp, with the familiar logo of the Blue Ridge Lane Homeowners Association stamped neatly in the corner. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably another reminder about trash day or some announcement about the annual block party. But when I opened it, my stomach sank. Inside was a letter written in that overly formal tone the HOA loved so much. It said they were regretfully informing me that I had violated one of their rules. Apparently, I now owned an unapproved pet, and because of this, my monthly dues were going up by $250. Effective immediately. I read the letter twice, maybe 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Unapproved pet. What did that even mean? Sure, I'd recently adopted Charlie, a scruffy little rescue dog with floppy ears and a personality bigger than life itself. But how could he possibly cost me $250 extra every month? And why did the HOA care so much about what kind of pet I had anyway? Then it hit me. These people didn't know who I was. They had no idea what I'd done for this neighborhood. If they did, they wouldn't have sent me this ridiculous letter. Because here's the thing. I wrote the original HOA bylaws. Yes, me. 5 years ago, when the HOA was just getting started, I was the one tasked with creating the rules that would govern our community. Back then, everyone agreed we needed guidelines to keep things running smoothly. No one wanted chaos, so I spent hours drafting policies that were fair, reasonable, and designed to bring us closer together as neighbors. Pets, for example, were allowed under my rules, as long as they weren't causing trouble. There was nothing in there about needing permission to own one. Nothing about fees either. Yet here I was, being told I'd broken a rule that didn't exist when I created the system. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't just about Charlie anymore. It was about principle. How could they twist the rules like this? Who gave them the authority to add clauses without telling anyone? And most importantly, why were they targeting me? By the time Greg, my husband, walked into the kitchen, I was pacing back and forth, clutching the letter like it was evidence in a crime scene. "You won't believe this," I said, shoving the paper toward him. He skimmed it quickly, his eyebrows shooting up. "Unapproved pet," he repeated, looking confused. "What does that even mean?" "I don't know," I snapped, throwing my hands in the air. "But I'm not paying an extra $250 for Charlie. Not when the rule they're accusing me of breaking doesn't even exist." Greg frowned, setting the letter down on the counter. "So what are you going to do?" That's when the wheels in my head started turning. This wasn't just about me. It was about everyone on this street. If they could slap a fee on me for something as harmless as adopting a dog, what would stop them from doing the same to someone else? What other rules had they made up without us knowing? "I'm going to fight back," I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. And trust me, they're not ready for what's coming. The next morning, I woke up with a plan forming in my mind. It wasn't enough to just be upset. I needed proof. I had kept a copy of the original HOA bylaws tucked away in my filing cabinet for years, and now it was time to dig it out. As I flipped through the pages, memories came rushing back. Writing those rules hadn't been easy. I'd spent countless nights researching, revising, and debating with myself over what would work best for our neighborhood. The goal was simple: create a system that balanced structure with freedom, ensuring everyone could live comfortably without feeling suffocated. When I found Section 7.2, the part about pets, I smiled grimly. Just as I remembered, there was no mention of needing approval or paying extra fees. The rule simply stated that pets were allowed as long as they didn't cause disturbances or pose safety risks. Charlie fit that description perfectly. He was friendly, quiet, and rarely barked unless someone knocked on the door. So why was the HOA acting like he was some kind of menace? Armed with the document, I decided to pay Margaret Hensley a visit. She was the current president of the HOA, and while she tried to act all polished and professional, I knew her type. Margaret thrived on control, always looking for ways to assert authority over others. Her house was easy to spot. It was the one with the perfectly symmetrical flower beds and the mailbox that looked like it belonged in a museum. When she opened the door, she seemed surprised to see me standing there, clutching the bylaws like a weapon. "Margaret," I said firmly, stepping inside before she could protest. "We need to talk." She led me to her living room, where everything was arranged with such precision it felt like walking into a showroom. She offered me tea, but I declined. There was no point pretending this was a casual chat. I got straight to the point. "I assume you're aware of the letter you sent me yesterday." Her expression shifted slightly, but she kept her tone calm. "Yes, Sarah. You received it, then." "I did," I replied, pulling out the bylaws and placing them on her coffee table. "And I'm here to explain why it's completely baseless. According to these, the original rules I wrote, there's nothing prohibiting Charlie. In fact, the language is clear. Pets are allowed as long as they're well behaved." For a moment, Margaret looked flustered. Her perfectly manicured fingers tapped nervously against her teacup. But then she recovered, her lips curling into a smug smile. "Times change, Sarah. Rules evolve. Surely you understand that we have to adapt to new circumstances." "Adapt," I repeated, incredulous, "or rewrite history entirely. Because let's be honest, Margaret, this isn't about adapting. It's about control. About making sure everyone toes the line, even if it means bending the truth to suit your agenda." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs elegantly. "If you feel so strongly about it, perhaps you should bring it up at the next meeting. Let the board decide." Her response infuriated me, but I forced myself to stay composed. Arguing with her wouldn't solve anything, not yet anyway. What I needed was allies. People who felt the same frustration I did. Because if Margaret thought she could intimidate me into backing down, she was sorely mistaken. As I left her house, my mind raced with possibilities. Greg was right. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for everyone on Blue Ridge Lane. If the HOA could target me for something as harmless as owning a dog, what would stop them from coming after someone else tomorrow? That evening, as I walked Charlie around the block, I started paying closer attention to my neighbors. Some waved hello, others avoided eye contact. A few even stopped to pet Charlie, cooing over how adorable he was. It struck me then, most people probably didn't realize how far the HOA had strayed from its original purpose. They saw the fines and the letters as annoyances, not realizing they were symptoms of a much bigger problem. By the time I got home, I knew exactly what I had to do. This wasn't going to end with a single conversation. Margaret wasn't going to back down easily, and neither was I. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let her, or anyone else, turn our neighborhood into a place ruled by fear and petty regulations. Not without a fight. The next day, I decided to take my fight beyond Margaret's doorstep. If she wasn't going to listen, maybe others would. I started small, chatting with neighbors during my usual evening walks with Charlie. At first, it felt awkward. I didn't want to come across as confrontational or overly dramatic. But the more I talked, the clearer it became that I wasn't alone in feeling frustrated. Take Mrs. Harper, for instance. She lived 2 doors down and always had a warm smile for Charlie whenever we passed by. When I mentioned the HOA letter, her eyes widened in disbelief. "They fined you for having a dog?" she asked, shaking her head. "That's ridiculous. Charlie is such a sweetheart." But then she hesitated, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. "To be honest, Sarah," she whispered, "I've been meaning to say something about their rules too. Last month, they sent me a notice saying my flower pots were non-compliant." Flower pots. Can you believe that? Her story made my blood boil even more. How could something as trivial as flower pots warrant a formal complaint? It was absurd. And yet, it wasn't just about flower pots or dogs. It was about the growing sense that the HOA cared more about nitpicking than fostering a welcoming community. Word spread quickly after that. By the end of the week, several neighbors had approached me with similar grievances. Greg from across the street confessed he'd been hit with a fine for leaving his recycling bin out one extra day. Another neighbor, Mr. Patel, told me he'd received a warning because his holiday lights stayed up until mid-January. It's not like anyone complained, he said, exasperated. They just showed up at my door one morning with a clipboard and a lecture. Each story added fuel to my determination. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were creating an atmosphere of fear and resentment. People were afraid to speak up, worried they'd become the next target. And who could blame them? Standing up to Margaret and her board felt like taking on a brick wall. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that change was possible. If enough of us banded together, maybe we could push back against this nonsense. So I called a meeting, not an official one, but an informal gathering at my house. I invited everyone who'd expressed frustration, along with a few others I thought might be sympathetic. To my surprise, nearly a dozen people showed up. We sat in my living room, sipping coffee and sharing stories. Some vented about unfair fines, while others talked about how the HOA's strict policies stifled creativity and individuality. One woman tearfully admitted she'd stopped decorating her porch altogether because she was tired of being criticized. Another man joked that he now measured his grass height with a ruler before mowing, just to avoid trouble. As the conversation unfolded, I realized something important. These weren't just complaints. They were cries for help. Everyone wanted the same thing. A neighborhood where kindness mattered more than conformity, where rules existed to serve us instead of controlling us. By the end of the night, we had a plan. We'd attend the next HOA meeting en masse, armed with evidence of their overreach. I'd bring my copy of the original bylaws, and others would share their letters and notices. Together, we'd demand answers and accountability. Walking them out afterward, I felt a spark of hope I hadn't felt in days. For so long, it had seemed like the HOA held all the power. But now, standing on my porch under the glow of the streetlights, surrounded by determined faces, I began to see a different future. One where Blue Ridge Lane belonged to its residents again, not to a group of self-appointed rulemakers. Margaret wouldn't know what hit her. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just me. Everyone who'd agreed to join this little rebellion seemed to carry it too. As we gathered outside the community center, there was a mix of nervous energy and quiet determination. Some neighbors clutched folders filled with letters and notices they'd received from the HOA over the years. Others whispered strategies under their breath, rehearsing what they planned to say when the time came. Greg gave me an encouraging nod as we walked in together. "You've got this," he said softly, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He believed in me, sure, but even he couldn't predict how Margaret and her board would react. Would they listen, or would they dig their heels in deeper? Inside, the room buzzed with murmurs. The usual suspects were already seated at the front table. Margaret, her second in command, Mrs. Delaney, and a few others whose names I barely remembered. They looked calm, almost smug, as if they already knew they had the upper hand. But then again, why wouldn't they? For years, no one had dared challenge them. Until now. When Margaret called the meeting to order, her tone was clipped and authoritative. She went through the usual formalities, reading the minutes from the last meeting, approving the agenda. But it was clear she wanted to get to the main event, addressing the growing unrest among homeowners. Several concerns have been raised recently regarding the enforcement of certain rules. She began, glancing pointedly at me. While the board understands that change can be difficult, it's important to remember that these policies are in place for the benefit of the entire community. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. I clenched my fists under the table, resisting the urge to interrupt right then and there. Instead, I waited until she opened the floor for discussion. That's when Greg stood up first. His voice wavered slightly, but he spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I'm here today because I think we need to talk about fairness," he said. "Last month, I was fined $100 for leaving my recycling bin out one extra day. No warning, no conversation, just a letter demanding payment. Is that really necessary?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone else chimed in. A young mother named Lisa who lived down the street. "And what about holiday decorations?" she asked, her cheeks flushed with frustration. "My kids love putting up lights every December, but apparently, keeping them up until January 15th is against the rules. Why does it matter so much?" One by one, people found their courage. Mr. Patel talked about his non-compliant mailbox color. Mrs. Harper shared her story about the flower pots. Each account added weight to our argument, painting a picture of an HOA that cared more about trivial details than the happiness of its residents. Finally, it was my turn. I stood slowly, holding up the original bylaws for everyone to see. "This document is the foundation of our neighborhood," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "It was written to create harmony, not division. Yet somewhere along the way, those principles were forgotten or ignored." Margaret's expression darkened. She tried to interject, but I didn't let her. Take Section 7.2, for example. There's nothing in here about needing approval for pets. Nothing about fees either. So why am I being penalized for adopting Charlie? And why are others facing similar treatment for things that don't actually violate these rules? The room fell silent. Even Margaret seemed momentarily speechless. But I wasn't done yet. If we're going to move forward as a community, we need transparency. We need accountability. And most importantly, we need leaders who care about us, not just the rules. As I sat back down, the room erupted into murmurs of agreement. Neighbors exchanged nods and smiles, emboldened by the collective strength of our voices. For the first time in years, it felt like we weren't just individuals living side by side. We were a team, united by a shared desire for change. But as Margaret finally regained her composure and prepared to respond, I knew the battle was far from over. This was only the beginning. Margaret didn't disappoint when it came to her response. She sat up straighter in her chair, smoothing the invisible wrinkles on her blouse as if gathering her thoughts, or perhaps buying time to regain control of the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but laced with an edge that made it clear she wasn't used to being challenged. "While I appreciate the passion behind these concerns," she began, her tone measured, "it's important to remember that the board operates in the best interest of the entire community. Rules exist for a reason, to maintain standards and ensure consistency." Her words landed like stones in a pond, rippling through the crowd. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Greg leaned over to whisper, "She's deflecting. Don't let her get away with it." I nodded subtly, knowing he was right. Margaret wasn't addressing any of our specific points. She was trying to paint us as unreasonable troublemakers who didn't understand the bigger picture. But we weren't about to back down. Mrs. Harper stood up next, clutching her cane with both hands. Her voice trembled slightly, but her resolve was unmistakable. "With all due respect, Margaret, what you call standards feels more like control. I've lived here for 20 years, and I've never seen so many rules targeting harmless things like flower pots or holiday lights. Are we really supposed to believe this is about consistency?" The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. Even some of the fence-sitters, the ones who hadn't spoken up before, nodded along. Margaret's polished facade cracked just a little, her lips pressing into a thin line. But she wasn't ready to concede. Instead, she turned her attention directly to me. "Sarah, you mentioned the original bylaws earlier. While your contribution was valuable, times have changed. Communities evolve, and so must their guidelines. Surely you can see that flexibility is necessary." It was a clever move. an attempt to undermine my argument by framing the changes as progress rather than overreach. But I'd anticipated this. Rising to my feet again, I held up the document once more. Flexibility is one thing, Margaret. Rewriting history is another. These amendments you've introduced, like requiring approval for pets or imposing arbitrary fines, they're not flexible adjustments. They're entirely new rules that were never voted on or approved by the homeowners. The room buzzed louder now, the tension palpable. People began flipping through their own copies of the letters and notices they'd brought, comparing them to the original bylaws. One neighbor shouted out, "She's right. None of this stuff was in the original rules." Margaret's composure faltered further. For the first time, I saw cracks in her armor, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She glanced at Mrs. Delaney beside her, but even the usually unflappable vice president looked uneasy. That's when Greg dropped the bombshell. Standing up again, he pulled out a stack of papers he'd been carrying. "We did some digging," he announced, his voice strong and confident. "Turns out, the HOA has made dozens of amendments over the years without proper homeowner approval. Entire sections of the bylaws have been rewritten without anyone knowing." Gasps rippled through the room. Neighbors leaned forward, eager to hear more. Greg continued, "This isn't just about fairness. It's about transparency. How can we trust the board when they've been operating outside the boundaries they claim to enforce?" Margaret tried to interrupt, but her protests were drowned out by the rising tide of voices. The meeting had shifted from a polite discussion to something far more powerful, a united demand for accountability. As I looked around the room, I realized we weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore. We were fighting for the soul of Blue Ridge Lane, for a neighborhood where kindness and common sense mattered more than rigid control. And for the first time, I truly believed we might win. The fallout from that meeting was swift and electric. Word spread like wildfire through Blue Ridge Lane, fueled by whispered conversations over fences, text messages, and even a hastily created group chat. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were now stepping forward, eager to join the growing movement. Margaret's polished veneer began to crack under the weight of scrutiny, and for the first time, she seemed unsure of her footing. The next few days felt surreal. Inspectors started showing up at my house, twice in 1 week, claiming they needed to assess compliance issues. My grass was deemed too long, though it was no different than anyone else's on the block. My mailbox, which I'd painted a soft blue years ago, was suddenly declared non-uniform. Each new complaint felt like another desperate attempt to intimidate me into submission. But instead of backing down, I documented everything. Every letter, every visit, every absurd accusation. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was evidence of how far the HOA would go to silence dissent. Meanwhile, Greg and I worked tirelessly behind the scenes. We drafted a petition demanding transparency and accountability from the board. Armed with copies of the original bylaws, along with Greg's findings about unauthorized amendments, we went door to door gathering signatures. Some neighbors hesitated at first, worried about retaliation, but most signed without hesitation. By the end of the week, nearly 3/4 of the homeowners had joined our cause. Margaret tried to counterattack, sending out emails urging residents to trust the process and warning against disruptive behavior. But her words rang hollow. People weren't buying it anymore. At the grocery store, at the park, even during morning coffee runs, conversations buzzed with talk of reform. The tide had turned, and there was no stopping it. When the next HOA meeting rolled around, the community center was packed to capacity. Every seat was taken, and latecomers lined the walls, craning their necks to see what would happen next. Margaret sat at the front table, flanked by Mrs. Delaney and the rest of the board, but their usual air of authority was gone. They looked uneasy, shifting in their seats as murmurs of anticipation filled the room. I opened the meeting this time, standing tall despite the nerves fluttering in my chest. "Tonight, we're here to discuss the future of Blue Ridge Lane," I said, my voice steady. "We've all seen how the current system has failed us, how rules meant to protect our neighborhood have been twisted into tools of control. It's time for change. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories. A young couple spoke about being fined for planting wildflowers in their yard. An elderly man recounted how he'd been pressured to repaint his front door because it didn't match the approved color palette. Each story added fuel to the fire, painting a vivid picture of a community stifled by unnecessary restrictions. Then came the moment we'd all been waiting for. Greg presented the petition, covered in signatures, along with a detailed list of demands. Full disclosure of all HOA amendments, a vote to reinstate the original bylaws, and the resignation of the current board if they refuse to comply. The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls like thunder. Margaret tried to respond, but her voice faltered. For the first time, she looked small, outmatched by the sheer force of collective will. When the final vote was cast, the decision was unanimous. The board would step down, and a new leadership team would be elected immediately. As I left the meeting that night, Charlie trotting happily beside me, I couldn't help but smile. Blue Ridge Lane wasn't perfect yet, but it was finally ours again. A place where people mattered more than rules. And for the first time, in a long time, I felt proud to call it home. Life on Blue Ridge Lane feels different now, lighter, somehow. The oppressive cloud of fear that once hung over the neighborhood has lifted, replaced by a sense of possibility and hope. Neighbors who used to avoid each other's eyes now stop for chats over fences or share gardening tips while tending to their yards. Charlie has become something of a local celebrity, his scruffy face earning smiles and pats from nearly everyone he passes. Even Mrs. Delaney, who once sneered at my unapproved pet, now slips him treats when she thinks no one's looking. The new HOA leadership team is a far cry from Margaret's iron-fisted regime. They're approachable, open to feedback, and genuinely invested in making the neighborhood a better place for everyone. At their first meeting, they promised transparency, a vow they've kept by posting all decisions online and inviting homeowners to weigh in before any changes are made. Gone are the days of secret amendments and surprise fines. Instead, there's collaboration, compromise, and a shared commitment to preserving what makes our community special. Margaret hasn't been seen much lately. Rumor has it she's planning to move to a gated community somewhere. An ironic twist, given how much she loved controlling ours. I don't hold any grudges, though. In a way, I feel sorry for her. She thought power meant control, but she never understood that true strength comes from trust and unity. That lesson wasn't just for her, it was for all of us. Greg likes to joke that I've become the unofficial mayor of Blue Ridge Lane. It's not entirely untrue. People often come to me with ideas or concerns, knowing I'll listen without judgment. Last week, Lisa asked if we could organize a block party to celebrate the end of summer. By the time the weekend rolled around, nearly every household had pitched in. Some brought food, others decorations, and a few even volunteered to DJ using nothing more than a Bluetooth speaker and an impressive playlist. Watching everyone laugh and dance under twinkling string lights, I realized how much we'd missed moments like these. Of course, things aren't perfect. There are still disagreements, like whether Mr. Petal's bright orange mailbox is too bold or if Mrs. Harper's flower pots are technically uniform enough, but they're handled with conversation, not confrontation. We've learned that rules exist to serve us, not the other way around. And sometimes, bending those rules a little is worth it if it means fostering kindness and connection. At night, I sit on the porch with Charlie curled up at my feet, listening to the hum of life around me. Kids ride bikes down the street, couples stroll hand in hand, and someone's wind chimes tinkle softly in the breeze. It's peaceful, not the sterile perfection Margaret once enforced, but a lived-in kind of harmony that feels real and honest. Looking back, I'm proud of what we accomplished, not just for standing up to the HOA, but for rediscovering the heart of our neighborhood. Writing the original bylaws taught me the importance of balance. Fighting for them reminded me why it matters. Rules can guide us, but they should never overshadow the humanity that binds us together. And as for Charlie, He's living proof that sometimes the best things in life are the ones you didn't plan for. The unapproved pets, the unexpected battles, and the friendships forged along the way.